So I've been doing this series of videos about books by authors whose work I would read irrespective of what they'd written, just because I like their writing so much and I like their style. And I was kind of thinking back to a couple of books written by some of my favorite authors that I really didn't love as much as other people did, or I didn't understand. And one of the things that I realized was that, you know how they say there's a season for love and for everyone that comes into your life? And I think books are like that as well. I think it matters when you meet a book and when you read it. The right book at the right time can be life-changing. Obviously, there are going to be books that you read and you'll never connect with, but I think for some books, some very special books, especially when written by people whom you generally adore, I think you just need to find those books at the right time in your life. Otherwise, you just might be a little too old for it or a little too young for it, or maybe you haven't felt a certain range of emotions, and unless you feel that, you don't connect with this book the way that the author intended you to. These are very half-formed, vague opinions that I have right now, but I'm sure I'll come back to it at a later date. But for the purposes of this video, what I wanted to talk about is that sometimes books need a second chance, and I don't often give books a second chance because there's just so much to read, like new stuff. And there's also all the books that I love already, so why would I go back and read things that I didn't like? But then I thought, you know, if it's an author whom I love and I've loved pretty much all their other work, then maybe there are some books that I should go back and look at. The Talisman Ring by Georgette Heyer is one of those books. So Georgette Heyer is one of my favorite authors. I first read her when I was about 12, I think, and I fell immediately in love, and I couldn't wait to read every single thing that she had ever written. And one of the books that the library had at the time was The Talisman Ring, and I was so eager to read it. And then it was just kind of meh. And it was such a disappointment, and I never went back to it after that. You know, I must have been like 13 or something when I first read it. And it would always confuse me because I would meet all these Heyer fans and they would all tell me how much they loved that book. And I thought, well, it must be like the Regency Buck, you know, a book that just isn't meant for me. The Regency Buck, by the way, is something that I have tried reading at various points in my life, and yeah, it's still not for me. But I have had success with some of other Heyer novels. So for example, when I first read The Foundling, I didn't really appreciate it, but then I read it again in my 20s and I thought it was charming and very funny. Similarly, I was very uncomfortable reading A Civil Contract. I think the story is lovely, but there's so many things about that book that just make me sad when I read it. But reading it again as an adult just made me appreciate it a lot more. So I thought, you know, maybe The Talisman Ring might be one of those books. And I was also encouraged by the fact that a lot of people referred it to as one of Heyer's more funny books, and I don't remember it being very funny. So for those of you who don't know, The Talisman Ring is about a young French refugee from the French Revolution who is brought to England by her English grandfather, who is dying and has arranged for her to marry her cousin Tristram. EUSTACIE is very French, and Heyer does these very comic things with foreigners in her novels. Sometimes it's pretty racist, but other times, you know, it's funny. And in this particular book, EUSTACIE is basically very blasé. And she wants romance, and she wants, you know, to be courted. And Tristram is this very sensible, straightforward kind of man who has had a disappointment in his youth, like a romantic disappointment, and therefore is a bit of a woman hater. And EUSTACIE kind of makes fun of him for it, and also tells him that she is planning to take a lover after they get married because she needs the romance in her life, and if he can't provide it, she'll just find it somewhere else. Obviously, this goes over like a bag of concrete with Tristram, and later on, EUSTACIE also discovers that they have another cousin called LUDOVIC, who is definitely the more romantic cousin and the one that she ought to have married, but LUDOVIC has been accused of murder and is in hiding. So what follows next is scenes that Heyer would use in later novels. So Ludovic has since joined a smuggling operation, and he and Eustacie meet and have this instant love for each other. Meanwhile, there's this very sensible young woman called Sarah Thane who is traveling through the neighborhood with her brother, and she comes across this insane family of cousins and gets entangled with them. And there are these extended sequences of her sparring with Tristram, which are very enjoyable. And as I was reading this book, I realized the reason why I don't have many memories of this book, or none that were good, is because I DNF'd. I don't do that very often, but I remembered why. It's because I can't stand Eustacie. And I realized this because when we got to Sarah Thane, I realized I'd never actually made it to her scenes in the book. And if I had, I would probably have loved it just as much as any other Heyer fan. So there's a lesson for you, folks. Sarah Thane has quickly become one of my favorite Heyer heroines, mainly because she reminds me of other Heyer female leads who are opinionated and independent. But the great thing about Sarah is that she has a brother, and her brother is so supportive. Unlike a lot of female leads in Heyer novels, she's not confined by her family. She and her brother are pretty much all they have for each other in the name of family, so they just travel the world together. And she's this really capable, efficient young woman. And she has a sense of humor, which is, you know, a hallmark of most Heyer heroines. And she also doesn't ascribe to any of the ladylike qualities that women are supposed to have at this time. And there's this very funny sequence where they're trying to solve the murder for which Ludovic is accused, and their plan sort of hinges on Sarah's ability to lie her way into this one mansion. And the lie that they come up with is that she wants to sketch the moldings. And that's when she confesses that she can't sketch. And there's this very funny sequence where Eustacie and Ludovic basically condemn her for not being ladylike enough to sketch. And Sarah's the only person who understands just how ridiculous it is, apart from the reader. And that whole sequence is just classic Heyer, where there's this one or maybe two characters who are in on the joke within the scene, and then there's the reader who also understands that this is absurd. The Talisman Ring is a murder mystery, it's a detective story, it's a historical romance. It's a combination of a bunch of different genres sort of woven together. And it really does represent Heyer at her best, but there is that extended sequence in the beginning which might put off some readers like it did me. I also go back and forth on Basil, who is the antagonist, because on the one hand, he's an excellent villain. He's smart, he's got his shit together, and he knows what he's doing. And he's truly sinister in that he might be one of the smartest people in the room, and it literally takes all of them together to somehow try and stop him. And generally, I enjoy characters like that, but the problem with Basil is a problem that you'll see in a few Heyer novels, in that he's queer-coded. And I never know what to make of it in her novels, because a lot of the things that she uses to construct the code are things that would have been historically appropriate. I mean, if you're talking about macaronis, for example, then they did present themselves as slightly effeminate and did spend a lot of time pursuing what would have been called effeminate pursuits. So they spent a lot of time on their makeup and on their clothes and their tailoring and things like that. So historically, things that would have been seen as womanly. So is she just describing a character in historically appropriate terms? Or is she speaking to her mid-20th century audience and saying, haha, look at this guy, I bet he's gay, where gay is a kind of threat in itself. It's this sort of uneasy meeting of the reader and the reader's own perceptions and cultural context, and the author and the author's context. Because we do know that Heyer had some very conservative views. I don't know how it changed towards the end of her life, but she wrote a bunch of contemporary novels as well in the beginning, and they just aren't very good. They're kind of horrible, gendered, heavily conservative screeds that have zero charm and nobody should read. So it's a complicated issue, and I still am kind of working my way through it. But this particular topic aside, it really was great to reread The Talisman Ring because it kind of felt like I was reading a new book by a favorite author, which is kind of hard because, you know, Heyer's been dead for quite a few decades by now. But Sarah Thayne is one of my favorites. I love how she wrote Tristram, and I love the way that she attaches herself to this group of people because she thinks they're ridiculous and they might entertain her. I really relate to that because there's definitely been points in my life and I have done that, and it's never really ended too well for me. And poor Sarah does get conked in the head for her pains, but she also gets the love of her life, so c'est la vie. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.